Hey friends, welcome to Flight Test Tech. I'm Josh. Today we're going to be showing you how to build our new FT Guardian. Now if you've never heard of an FT Guardian before, the FT Guardian is a fantastic indoor-outdoor mini quad that you can build very easily. Now the nice thing about the new FT Guardian is you have the ability to build with a stronger frame and also upgrade electronics. Mainly our new 1104 naked bottom 5400 kV motors combined with our JHE 411 ESC. Now the beautiful thing about this all-in-one control board is it can actually grow with you, which means when you build this Guardian and you're ready to move to your next step, you don't have to reinvest in a huge control board. Also, this is the latest and greatest technology, which means your tunes, your speed are going to be at their very best. This is going to be a multi-part video, which means basically in this video we're going to be showing you how to assemble the frame, how to mount the motors, and how to do your preliminary soldering. Once we have that done, we're going to hand you off to the next video, and that's where we're going to be doing our programming. Now with this quad build, the motors are all plug and play, which cuts out about 2/3 of the soldering you're going to need to do, but you will need to do some basic soldering. For that, if you're new to soldering and you need some helpful tips, we have a link down below that'll give you just that. The tools that you're going to need for this build is going to be a 1.5mm hex, a soldering iron with a fine tip, some solder, and to make soldering easy, a pair of hemostats, some side cuts, or needle nose pliers or tweezers would be highly recommended. Let's go ahead and get our materials in order, and we find that's easier to basically mount the motors and the control board before we do our soldering. So we're going to do that right now. Now with your Guardian kit, you see everything that's included here. Make sure that you don't get rid of the box that it comes in, because this later becomes your carrying case. Let's go ahead and get all of our materials in order, and we'll get started. The first thing we're going to do in our frame assembly is going to be mounting the motors. Now before we mount the motors, the way that we arrange the motors to allow the wires to route properly is incredibly important. To do that right, we're going to make sure that we have our frame oriented the way that we want it to be. In this case, I want the back of the frame pointing towards me and the front of the frame pointing towards the camera here. The easiest way to tell what the front and the back of the frame are is you're going to notice two little holes on the bottom of the frame. That's going to indicate that's the back. That's where your little receiver wires will be able to pop through later on. Now that we have that, let's go ahead and pop out our motors. And you're going to see our motors have a nice little connector. This means you don't have to solder your motors to your control board. It makes it incredibly easy. Now for routing our motor wires, we want to route the motor wires so they go along and towards each other in the center, and then they're going to feed towards the control board together. In our screw case, you're going to notice that we have our prop screws, and the shorter ones are our motor mount screws. So let's go ahead and separate the prop screws. You're always going to end up with extras. There's our prop screws that are longer, and here's our 4 motor mount screws. If you have a crafty kit, we include in our crafty kits a multi-tool right here. And in that multi-tool, we have everything you need to be able to assemble this. Once we have the orientation of our motors proper, we'll line up the screws, and I'd never like to tighten the screws until I get all 4 of them threaded in evenly. So I'm just going to stop just shy, and that gives us a little bit of wiggle that we need to be able to get all of them to thread in nice and easy. If you notice that any of your screws are turning really hard, there's a chance that maybe they're not lined up properly, or that you've cross-threaded it. Simply back it out, loosen up all your screws, and then re-thread it. There we go. Now that I have that 4th one in, I can snug it down. It's very important to make sure that you don't accidentally put the prop screws in where the motor mount screws are supposed to go, because that bolt will go through and damage your windings. Now that we installed this motor, let's do the same process on the other 3. Again, when we're mounting these, we're making sure that the wires are going the direction we want them to. This really makes a very clean and simple build. Once you've installed all 4 of your motors, feel free to pause the video and make sure it looks exactly like this. In other words, each motor has the leads coming towards a center point, which is going to be this hole here and here. Once you're happy with the motor in placement, we're going to move on to install our center post to let the motor wires wrap around towards the flight control board. We're also going to mount the standoffs for that flight control board. Let's go ahead and do that right now. You're going to notice that the screws for the standoffs are actually nylon, and this is for a good purpose. We'd much rather see the stress of an impact be taken through the screws that are easy to replace than through the actual frame. So for that, we only need to just slightly snug these down. You don't have to go overly tighten, and they'll be nice and strong. Let's go ahead and open up our flight control board here. We're just going to peel off this little void label. And you're going to notice with our flight controller, we have our all-in-one board, which we'll take out and put right here. And there's quite a bit included in our flight control board. First, we have our flight control board here, and you're going to notice that there's an arrow that's pointing forward. We're going to always want to make sure when we work on our frame that the arrow is pointing away from us, and also that the frame front is pointing away from us as well. We're also going to be given a lot of extra goodies that I'd strongly recommend that you keep, because in future builds as you grow in the hobby, you're going to want to go ahead and go back and utilize some of these. The piece that we're looking for right now is going to be our little standoffs, and that's going to be in this packet right here. There'll be little contents of this guy right on the table. There we go. And the way that this board is going to be mounted is going to be just like you see here. And once we've laid this on, you'll see the holes that we need to put our standoffs through. It's very simple. We'll just pass the screw through. And for this application, I'm going to use a taller knurled nut first to fasten this down. Just going to spin it by hand and snug it up just like that. And we'll go to the opposite corner. Again, we're going to use a taller knurled nut. The reason I want to use a taller knurled nut to hold this down is because it gives me the ability to really dress my wires underneath the flight control board. This is going to make it really clean as far as installation goes, and the cleaner an installation and the cleaner your build is, the more reliable and the more durable it's going to be. We can always go back later with a 1.5mm hex and tighten these down the rest of the way. So before we put anything else down, now would be a really good time to be able to address our motor wire leads, but just because there's not a lot here. What we're going to do is one lead at a time. We're going to take the lead around the outer post on the other side of the inner post, and then we're going to lay them right here together. So I'll do the opposite here. And this helps us with motor orientation because you can see that this motor and this lead are still going to be on the proper quadrant, which is going to be the right front or the left front or the right rear or the left rear. Once we're happy with that, we're going to pull this nice and snug just so it's nice and neatly dressed, and we're going to zip tie it right in this area right here. There we go. What I like to do is just get it almost down to the point of snug. We don't want to make this super tight. I'm going to dress this down, put a little bit of tension on it, and there we go. Again, it's not completely tight, it's just snug. Same thing on the other side. And again, anytime that you can dress up your motor leads and your wires to be really clean, a clean build is definitely more reliable and also more durable, and less likely to have unwanted things like getting your wires in the prop happen. Again, feel free to pause your video at any time to make sure that your board and everything looks exactly like what you see here. I'm going to go ahead and dump the contents of this little baggie out here, and you're going to see it comes with an XT60 and battery leads, but for this application we need an XT30. We've already included that in the kit, and that's going to be right here. So we're going to put that aside, and we're going to also locate our 4 little grommets right here. I'm just going to go ahead and pinch these grommets. This is kind of a personal preference. I'm just going to again give myself a little bit of space on the bottom because I want to be able to dress up all my wires going underneath it and give it a little bit of extra room on the bottom. Again, I'm making sure that the 2 holes indicating the back of the frame are pointing towards me. The arrow is pointing away from me. There's the front of it. I'm just going to gently lay this down right over my holes like that. Gotta spread these out, get them in the little areas that I want them to be. Not going to make my connections yet. Now that I have the board set in place, you're going to notice that pointing towards the rear of the board we have a plus and a minus. This is going to be where this little tiny battery lead goes. Now you're also going to notice that this is a through hole connection. In other words, this passes down through. It's really important that you get a really good solid connection on your battery lead, because if it comes loose, you lose all power, all control. We're going to go ahead and turn on our soldering iron, and it's really important that you have a soldering iron with a nice fine point. I'm going to turn it up nice and warm. There we go. And while that's heating up, you can use a flex pen. I like to use a little barbecue skewer. I'm going to rub a little bit of flux on my positive and on my negative. Most connectors with bare ends are always tinned, and you're going to notice that that simply just will not pass through the holes. You don't want to surface mount this, so what we're going to do is we're going to carefully cut this out. I'm just going to use my nails and I'm going to strip off the very edge. Now this is going to go nice and neat down in between it. You can go from the bottom up or the top down, it's okay, whichever way you choose. You're then going to want to flip this over. You can mount your battery lead either top down or bottom up. I'm gonna go ahead and mount it from the bottom up, and this is gonna give me the ability to have a much nicer dressed piece, but also when I set this down, it kind of acts as helping hands. I'm just gonna loosely set the board right on its little stands here. We'll do one side at a time. Now that our main battery lead is soldered, we can now press this down a little bit further here. I'm not gonna go all the way down quite yet. Now that we have our main battery lead on, we're gonna go ahead and next install and then plug in our motors. Now make sure as you plug in your motors that you follow the wires down and around and you plug in the right motor with the right quadrant. In this case, the back right lead is gonna go with the back right connector. We're gonna line that up and plug it in. And then we'll go to the right front. Take your time, make sure that it's orientated properly so it slides in easily. There we go. There's the left front. And then finally the left rear. There's a little tiny tab on these. That little tiny tab is going to face downwards. Feel free to pause the video, make sure that your piece looks just like what you see here. Now this all-in-one board is incredibly advanced. It has lots of great features like programmable LEDs, buzzers, etc. What we're going to be showing you in this video is basically the basics. In other words, what you need to tap into for your receiver and also what you need to tap into for your FPV. Now for our FPV, we're going to be using the Caddx Ant. The Caddx Ant is an all-in-one, which means you don't need to provide separate power for the receiver and also the camera. What we do need though is a 5-volt reference. In this case, we're going to look at the very front here. The very front pad is going to be our ground. The next one back is going to be your 5-volt. Now we're going to show you a diagram right now on the screen. That diagram shows you all the different voltages and the references for each individual pad. Feel free to pause the video, locate the ground and the 5-volt for the camera, and those are going to be the 2 pads that we're going to solder next. So once again, making sure the orientation is where we want it, I'm going to go ahead and tin the pads for both my ground and my 5-volts at the very front here on the left side. And while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and tin the tabs that I need for my Radio Master receiver. We're going to be using the R81 for this. The nice thing about the R81 is basically an FR Sky receiver and it takes a 5-volt reference. So for that, I'm going to tin the ground, next one over, which is going to be my 4.5 volts. And then I'm going to hop, let's see, it looks like 2 down to my S bus. All right. Next, we're going to go ahead and take our little Caddx all-in-one ant here. I'm going to give myself plenty of space here. This is going to mount just in front and come back to these tabs. I want to be able to tuck this under and dress a little bit, so I'm going to cut this about 1 inch or 3/4 of an inch past the voltage regulator. Just like any time that we have bare wire, we're going to strip that off and we're going to tin it. Now I can take my ground wire to exactly where I need it. That's going to be the very front left pad. Everything's tinned, so all I need to do is just simply quickly touch it. There we go. Little tug. And the next one over is going to be my 5-volt. Little tug. All right, my camera's in place. Let's go ahead and put our attention now towards our receiver. Now with our receiver, we have a couple different options. We can use the existing wires that we have here that have been included in our kit, or with our R81, we already have a little piece of wire here. I'm going to go ahead and use what's included with the receiver. And included with our little R81 receiver, you're going to see a tiny little set of instructions on binding and everything else that you need to know. But also what's very important is you're going to see the pinout that we need to go to get our power, our negative, and our signal. If you look very, very closely, you'll also see those printed on the board. These are through-hole designs, so I'm just going to go ahead and pop it through the very bottom. I'll locate my ground first. There we go. Next is going to be our positive. One thing I kind of like to do with these little tiny thin wires is I can bend these away from the control board. Kind of helps them hook on a little bit. There we go. And then finally we have our signal. Sometimes you'll see the signal marked as an S, other times you'll see it marked as something more like a horseshoe. They both mean the same thing. And just like anything we solder, we're always going to inspect it, make sure it's nice and shiny, make sure that no pads are touching. That looks great. Once we have all of our leads made and everything's been inspected and we're happy with it, slide on the little piece of heat shrink cover. Make sure that you cover up your antenna wires and also the leads. Just split the difference right in the middle and then use a heat gun to shrink it down. If you don't have a heat gun, you can use a lighter very carefully, or you can actually use the heat radiating from your soldering iron. Just be careful not to let your soldering iron rest on the piece itself. I'm just holding it just above and waving underneath. Now we don't need all this wire to be able to solder this on, so I'm going to go and cut this about 1.5 inches or so away from this top. Pretty much right in the middle. And just like before, we're going to strip the ends, we're going to twist them, and we're going to tin them. And making sure that we're referencing our little diagram here, the first one we're going to start with is going to be our ground. Second one is going to be our voltage. And finally, the final one is going to be our signal, or S-bus. So at this point, all of our soldering is now done. Now this board is incredibly powerful, which means you can add LED lights, you can add buzzers, you can add locators, you can add a whole bunch of really cool features to this that can grow with you. But for this application with the Guardian, we don't need to move any further. But before we go ahead and start finishing off this frame, we want to make sure that we don't have any accidental shorts. The easiest way to do that is by taking a simple cheap voltmeter like you see here, turn it down to continuity, and when you do that, what you're going to have is an audible tone when it shorts. At this point, we're going to go to every one of our solder connections, and I'm going to put one lead on the negative and one lead on the positive. We're going to start with the battery connection first. You're going to notice that there's no continuity. If you touch both the positive and negative and you heard something like this, we'd know that there's a problem. At this point, we can go ahead and we can hold on our leads to the negative or the ground, and we can go to our other grounds, and it's a strong likelihood we should have continuity on all three of those. At this point, we're 100% confident that we have no shorts. If you have any other components that you decide to put on, like maybe a buzzer or some LEDs, make sure that you check your positives and your grounds and your signals to make sure nothing's shorted. And now let's go ahead and dress up the rest of this frame here. I'm going to start with my receiver, and my receiver is going to have a little tiny bind button. Now if you're building along with me and you're using the R81 receiver for Radio Master or FR Sky, you're going to see there's a little tiny bind button on here, right there. That bind button is what we're going to want to have facing up. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and open this up a little bit, lift it up, and I'll just lift up one of my ends. So to route my receiver and make it kind of nice, I'm just going to route one wire on each side. So I'm just going to lift up my control board just a little bit. I'm going to pass the one wire down the one side, like so, and we'll pass the other wire down the other side. Now we can use Velcro, we can use a zip tie, we can use lots of different stuff. I'm just going to grab a little piece of double-sided tape right here. I'm going to cut a little tiny chunk out of it. And I'm going to stick it on the bottom of my receiver. Again, it's really important that you make sure that your bind button is facing up or you won't be able to access it in the future. Take this all the way against the standoff and we'll press it down into place. There we go. And then we can press everything else down. And with my antennas towards the back, I can just feed those down through the two little tiny holes that we have. Later I can lock those down with a drop of hot glue if I want, or even just a piece of tape. Now that our receiver's in place, we're going to go into our kit and we're going to get the 3D printed camera mount for our Caddx amp. Now because 3D printed pieces all vary just a little bit different, before I go ahead and put this in, I just want to make sure that this passes through easily. If it's at all a little bit tight, you can take a razor blade and simply open it up just a little bit. And to mount this, all we need to do is we just need to open this up. Let's bend this open, slide it in, and then let it close. At this point, we can put all the additional standoffs we have, and then once we have the standoff in the front, we can slide our FPV camera down on top of it. You may have to reposition slightly the receiver as we slide this all the way down to the bottom. Now we can go ahead and install all the rest of the standoffs on the lower frame. Feel free to pause the video now and make sure that your frame looks exactly like what you see here. Once you're happy with the way everything looks at, we can finish off our frame build by simply installing our top piece. You're going to notice that the antenna of the FPV camera goes right through the slot of the front plate, and also our battery lead will pop up through the slot in the back plate. Once we have this lined up, go ahead and fasten the rest of your screws down. Alright friends, at this point, this video done and this portion of the build is done. Obviously we have a complete frame ready to go here, but our next video is going to show you how to bind your receiver, how to program your quad, and then take you through your first flights. Thanks so much for being part of the Flite family. We'll see you in the next video.